This is Tim Velder. I'm sure many of you know him. He's from the Vale area, correct? Or Newell area. Oh boy. Boy, did I stir up a hornet's nest there. Yeah. They are not the same place. Sorry. Uh, so anyway, this is Tim Velder. He comes to us from Sundance, right? Yes. And he's gonna do our talk today.
So this is a story that a lot of people remember. There's fewer people with living memory that recall this, so it's very appropriate. We do this during Peace Officers Memorial Week, which Memorial Day was on May 15th. So here we are on May 17th, and I think this is appropriate time to make this presentation to this audience. I've never done this one in Meade County before, so. George Sitz was a fugitive, um, three-time murderer, and this is kind of the story of how he tried to elude uh, lawmen and his subsequent capture and ultimate death by the electric chair. Um, the case is also about the sacrifice of two heroic officers and their tireless search by their friends and across the frozen tundra of the upper Great Plains. And he, so George Sitz, just to get down to the thing, who was he? He was exposed, he's on the left here. He was exposed to a life of mischief at an early age. He grew up in the Albert Lee area of Minnesota, Austin, Mower County, right on the border with Iowa. His parents, his father was a traveling salesman. His mother, I believe, was a piano teacher, maybe. And they divorced, left him with grandma. And since age 7, he was raised from that point on by his grandmother. And he told people that he was raised by pickpockets and bootleggers. So he probably was surrounded by people that were very nice people. He was arrested a few times before he went real sideways. So he landed in jail for some small time heists in his early 1930s. He was also a boxer named Kid Curry, I think his name was. Maybe they called him that. But he wasn't very good. But he was also athletic. He didn't smoke. He didn't drink because he felt that that would compromise him physically. He also did a lot of practice with handguns and firearms and got to be pretty adept at using them for pleasure and practice, and then later on evil intentions. So he disappears during the radar during the war years, but emerged on Wednesday, December 12th, 1945. He had been in jail for either stealing a car or possessing a stolen vehicle and armed robbery. And so he got out, and Minneapolis, St. Paul area, some of the law enforcement people knew him, obviously. And so he was chatting with one of the city officers who knew him from the jail days, and he was complaining about not having any money. And so the officer said, well, because he was married at the time, George Sitz was married and estranged from his wife, understandably, who wanted nothing to do with him. He also had a girlfriend who he had been exchanging letters with. But the officer said, well, why don't you get a job coming cleaning the jail? You know, we can have you do that and we'll pay you. You've been doing it for free all these years. Why would? And he says, no, I don't want to work. I think my wife will earn enough money to support me too. And so he had no intention of being employed. So he needed some money to travel to go see this girlfriend who was supposedly in Oregon. And he didn't have any money to get there. So he robs this liquor store, shows up, tells the clerk, says, what do you have? And he tells the clerk, well, how about everything in the cash register? And the clerk laughs, and so then he pulls the gun and he's standing there holding the gun. Clerk makes a decision. He's pictured there in the center. He's going to run to the back and grab his own pistol and have a little shootout. So they shoot each other, and George gets shot in the shoulder. Eric Johansson gets shot multiple times and finally in the head and is killed and left there for dead. George walks right past the cash box and doesn't take any money at all, just leaves. So he doesn't even steal anything. And so now he's on the run, shows up at his wife's house. If you've been to Minneapolis, St. Paul, there's a big interstate that goes through there, kind of cuts the town in half. She lived on that north part of town there where the cathedral area is, and some spots there where there's a lot of row houses. Well, shows up at her house, he's all shot up. She doesn't want anything to do with him. Hit the road, get out of here. So he finds a job at a feed store west of St. Paul. He's working for them for a little bit, and he's only using one arm because one shoulder's had his bullet in it, and he's still be able to lift feed sacks and that kind of thing. But the guys thought he was a little weird. But he is able to talk the owner into buying him a new suit, a brown suit with a red sweater, which was something. And so then they found out, oh, he's this guy they're looking for. And so they finally turn him in, and he's captured, and without a fight. Quick trial. And so by January 20th, he's behind bars at the Hennepin County Jail for life in prison. Somehow talked the judge into letting him stay in jail an extra few days because he wanted to be able to talk to his wife. She didn't want anything to do with him, but that's the story he told the judge. Gets to stay in jail a little bit longer. And one of the other prisoners there, most of those guys were in there for bad checks, fraud, one car theft, younger people. At this time, George was 32, age 32. So one of the guys, his well-meaning girlfriend, smuggles in a hacksaw blade in his shoe. And he doesn't really know what to do with it. He says, well, I got this blade, but I don't really know what to do. George knows what to do. So George figures out a way to saw through the bars, gets 3 guys to come with him, and he grabs one of those things that you turn on top of a water pipe. In the old time, they're kind of round and jagged. Sticks one of those in a sock and uses that to knock out the radio man at the jail after they sawed through the bars. Hits him a couple times, puts him in the hospital, and they're running around the building trying to figure out how to get out. And one person ignored him, thinking, well, those are the window washers. They're just trying to, and he said, shut the window. So they crawled out the window and closed it behind him. So they got away. So now they're on the run. George takes off by himself. He doesn't want to travel with friends or anything. So off he goes. So he's been convicted of murder, but now he's on the run. And he steals a vehicle with a Minnesota license number, and I believe it's a 1937 black Buick sedan, and gets a license plate from Sioux Falls with a South Dakota number, and keeps heading east. And he goes through Brookings and steals some gasoline there, and then let's see here. So yeah, he heads through Brookings and Highmore, Blunt, steals some gas in those towns, doesn't pay for anything. And then he arrives in a small town of Sulphur, South Dakota, and where he fills up with gas. Now, Sulphur, as you know, is in Meade County. It's on the old Highway 212, and it's the shortest, Highway 212 is the shortest route to the Rockies. Get west in those days. No I-90, of course. And so this is his way to get the express lane across country. The authorities thought he was going to cross at Gettysburg. They didn't get there fast enough. He got across the river before they got there, so he was able to get through the net. So at this point, they weren't sure where he was. They just knew he was on the run. So let's see if I have the. Can you point out on the map where Sulphur? Yeah.
You're too high up, aren't you? Because you're on Z-Block.
Yep. If I had my little pointer, go up there, and Sulphur's kind of right up there. Between Newell and Faith. And so I'm gonna. Yeah, this is a map from the 50s, and so it came from the Butte County Auditor's Office. So I tried to get the oldest period one I could find. So he gets to Sulphur, starts chatting up the gas station owner there, Carl Settle. Start chatting, George Sitz was a personable guy. He would talk to you and shoot the breeze. It seemed like an average person. Most civilians he got along with. He hated police, but civilians he was fine with. And so got to talking, going back and forth, filled with gas, punches the gas, and off he goes. Carl Settle grabs the car, hangs on for a few yards, then lets go and falls off. If Carl had known that this guy was a fugitive, he probably wouldn't have been as aggressive. But he did call ahead and say, well, the guy stole gas. You might want to be on the lookout for him. And so en route from Sulphur to Newell, let's get that map going again. En route from Sulphur to Newell, the McGuire Ranch, and I'm not sure if that was in Meade County or Butte County, but he stopped there. No one home because this was in January, so a lot of people went to town for winter. And so the McGuires weren't home, but Mr. McGuire was a World War I veteran and had a pistol there and some honey and some other provisions that George took. Well, at this point, no one knew George was armed, but now he was. And so he headed on, went through Newell, and then arrived in Belle Fourche, where Carl Settle had called ahead and told Sheriff Dave Malcolm that someone stole gas. But that's all he said. He didn't say it was George Sitz, didn't say he was an armed fugitive, just said this guy stole gas. Just thought you should know. So Sheriff Malcolm was elected sheriff in 1944. He was a longtime deputy. His family immigrated from Scotland. And a lot of the cases that he worked on prior to this were small-time thefts and poaching. Furs were a big thing back then, so if you had to prove you had the right to have those furs on you. And family farm was around the Nisland area. And so also a World War I veteran. And he was married and just had a 9-month-old baby. And so first child, his wife was a teacher from Black Hills State University where she got her education. George Sitz stops at the gas station in Belle Fourche. Attendant at that time was John Sigmund. And John Sigmund kind of connected some dots there after Sitz inquired about getting a tire repaired and directions to Sheridan, Wyoming. And headed south on Highway 85 towards Spearfish. And so Mr. Sigmund, even though George paid for the gas and the tire stuff, he called ahead and told the sheriff, I got some suspicions about this guy. He seems a little sketchy. So Sheriff Malcolm heads south on Highway 85 to find the suspect. And Sheriff Malcolm at that time only had the license number. He didn't probably know for sure that Sitz had a pistol on him. And somewhere in there that Sitz comes to the bottom of Redwater Hill. If you've been on that road, it's steep down and then it flattens out there at the valley at the bottom. A young mom had stopped to attend to a crying baby, which lifelong thing, obviously. And so she was digging in the back seat, dealing with the baby, and George pulls over, pokes his head in and just says, take care of that baby, and then he takes off again. He may have been looking for a car to steal, swap vehicles, maybe somebody he could steal from, take her license plate, something, but he saw her situation and said, you know what, I'll leave that be, I'll just keep going. So meanwhile, Sheriff Malcolm calls ahead to Agent Tom Matthews in Spearfish, who was at home, just sat down for dinner about 6 o'clock. And says, this guy stole gas. I think I got his track down. He's heading towards Spearfish. So Agent Matthews gets up from the dinner table, tells his wife and 2 young kids, the guy who drove off without paying for gas, I'm going to go intercept him at the Y there north of Spearfish. And so Sitz had already gotten south. This was what the Y looked like back then. It's now exit 10 in Spearfish. And so it's been completely redone as far as how it looks through there. But Matthews comes from the Spearfish side and sets up a little block there on the road. And here comes George in the stolen car. And it's a police car because he's got a little light going and talks to him through the window and says, you better turn around and go back and pay for that gas. So, okay. But George just turns around and starts driving back to Belle Fourche. And meanwhile, here's Malcolm coming from the other way, and he's got the roadblock going north. So they're going to stop him. So they conduct a stop. Stops are way different now than they were back then. So it's kind of like everybody gets out of the car. If you get out of the car now, it could be bad. So Malcolm gets out of the car, Matthews gets out of the car, George Sitz gets out of the car, and George looks at Sheriff Malcolm, thinks he's a farmer, doesn't do anything. He knows Matthews is a cop, so he shoots him first. Then he turns and shoots Malcolm. Then he shoots Matthews in the head. Then he goes and dispatches Malcolm in the head as well. Dips down, grabs Matthews' gun and wallet, jumps back in his car and drives away. And it took probably less than 2 minutes to do the whole thing. Just happens to be a trucker from Sundance was coming right through there. And as he went through, he heard what he thought was a tire blowing up or a car backfiring, but it was actually the gunshots taking place. And so he went on into town and told the authorities that something weird's going on up there. It looked like there was a body on the ground and somebody was digging through. Sitz is long gone, but he's headed south toward Deadwood, Whitewood area. This is just before it started snowing. So we're gonna, if you have some constitutions about bodies on the highway, be warned, because here they come. So about 7 o'clock is when this went down. Both officers were shot. This was after, some time had gone by, but the snow was about to get there. And so they didn't have a lot of time. There's no way they could track where he went at this point. George Sitz, this is his car in this newspaper photo. Gets, as you can see, it snowed quite a bit overnight there. And this was the road, the Crook City Road between Whitewood and that Highway 85. There's a road that cuts through there. This is where George decided to drive. And so the weather had now turned ugly, wind, bitter cold, and Lawrence County Sheriff J.O. Twyford was leading the investigation and did lead the investigation throughout. And where did George go? Because the car got stuck. Well, this little abandoned stone schoolhouse is where he hung out for a while. It's still there. I think it's privately owned, and it's on maybe the historical register, so they can't do much with it, but it's right there by the road. If you're driving through there, you can't miss it. So he was hiding up in the attic and started a little fire to keep warm, got a little too aggressive with the fire and burned his shoes. And so had to take his shoes off, but the police searched the building while he was in it, didn't look upstairs. They went back a second time and discovered, oh yeah, he was here, but it was too late. He'd already gone. But some were saying that the police were so either frenetic or even scared of him that they didn't want to find him. Some of them didn't want to find him. Others were mission oriented. So these photos were obviously afterwards that when they did the return trip, they found his coat and some other belongings. But George did manage to craft some kind of moccasins out of an old tarp. And so he used that to walk to Deadwood. So he walks into Deadwood in the middle of the night, and he's looking for a place to hide. And everybody at this point, the authorities were saying, lock your doors. Be on the lookout for weird people that you don't know. And he's armed and dangerous. And so everybody was supposed to lock their doors. Well, one person didn't get their door locked, and that was Ross Dunn, happened to be the former Deadwood police chief. And so Sitz gets into his cellar and hangs out there. No one looks and finds him there for a week. And so here's Sitz hanging out in the former Deadwood police chief's cellar from Monday, January 28th till early February. So Sitz is now in a police chief's lockup, but sitting pretty with fresh canned goods down there and a place no lawman is going to look. So he can hear the radio going on upstairs. He hears all the intel that's happening because Dunn was also helping with the search. And so this is just the door to the cellar. How he probably got down in there. Looks like an antique store now. So Edna Mae Dunn, age 4, and Doris Irene Dunn, age 11, made several trips into the basement, unaware of Sid's presence down there to get canned goods for mom, that kind of thing. So for 7 days, sits down there and eats. And one of the pictures shows that he even put the lids back on and put them in the container downstairs. So he didn't even, those canning jars are a big deal. So, so the daughters are going downstairs, and George is being quiet and hiding, and here listening to the police reports upstairs. And during this time, our Arpan farmer Elmer Connor is named Butte County Sheriff. Funeral services for Malcolm are held in Belfouche, and he's buried at Pine Slope Cemetery. Police are getting reports from Shadron, Nebraska, to check on reports down there that maybe someone jumped a train. Sheridan police in Wyoming detain a man that looks like Sitz, but it's not him. So the dragnet's out there now. They're looking, but they can't find him. Just wanted to share this with you. This is Doris, the older daughter. I took this a year or two ago. She just happened to have a can of peaches at her house in Rochford. And that's her. She's the older daughter. She did mention to me that her dad blamed her for not locking the door, and she felt bad all these years. But I think it was not her fault. So, but as far as I last heard, she's alive and well, living in Washington State. Her son found me. Yeah. Yeah. He sent me an email because they still have property up there. Now it's actually the Dunn property. And so, as you know, movies during that time, a lot of these fugitive film noir, crime noir movies were going on, and just happened to have these were playing at the Sturgis movie theater at that time. So crime was on people's minds, and it was a real thing happening in the community at that, as they were speaking. On Tuesday, January 29th, some officers set up a roadblock at Deadwood. They were forcing every car to stop. They searched vehicles for any occupants. They actually asked some of the students from Black Hills State to help with a house-to-house search in Spearfish, until one of the students said, well, can I have a gun? Because he's got a gun. And no. And so they called off that idea because people weren't answering their doors, because we're supposed to lock our doors and not let in any strangers. And here's a stranger at my door. So it was kind of a bad deal, but it was the comments were it's like an armed camp in Spearfish. You go there, there's guns everywhere and police looking, searching everything. So some people were taunting police with crank phone calls saying they're George Sitz, and then they'd hang up. But every piece of information they got was followed up to make sure. Ray Torrett of Spearfish ran the roadblock en route home from his job at the Homestake Mine. Officers actually fired on his vehicle, believing him to be Sitz, but then Torrett, once they got him stopped and questioned and figured out, he just said he didn't know it was a roadblock. So that was his excuse, and he got away with that one. So no trouble there. No bullets were flying. So finally, around Wednesday, January 30th, the police announced that they have no idea where Sitz is. They've looked and they just can't find him. This is what the cellar looked like after the fact. That's Mr. Dunn checking things out. Again, they're searching cabins, shacks, out of the way buildings. And while all this time Sitz is down in the cellar, and he probably had some time to decompress, obviously thinking about he had killed 2 officers north of Spearfish. And he told his next victim that he had found God during this time underground. And a reward had been set up for about $1,250 for the capture of Sitz. And that was put out by the Rapid City Journal and Black Hills Badlands and Lakes Association. You put out the reward. So about 8 p.m. Monday, February 4th, Sitz grabs a pair of Ross Dunn's kid skin boots and walks out of the cellar because they unlocked the door. Thinking the heat was off, he was gone somewhere. And so now he's looking for a car to steal in Deadwood. And the first car he came to was a man and woman who were apparently necking in the car, so Sitz left them alone. And so he gets into the Pluma area where a filling station worker, Leonard Ronneberg, had stopped on Lee Street in Deadwood for a sandwich and some magazines. And when Ronneberg returned to his car, a 1939 Chrysler sedan, which I don't have a picture of his car, but it looked like this, except it was tan, in case you want to know. Sitz was already inside and greeted Mr. Ronneberg with a pistol in the face, said, "Get in, do what I say, and you won't get hurt." And so the 28-year-old Leonard Ronneberg stayed calm, drove to Spearfish. They drove around for 2 hours, okay, looking for a gas station. And so then he forced Ronneberg to drive him into Wyoming, where they finally filled up at the gas station in Beulah. And Sitz liked to talk, of course, and was talking to Ronneberg in just a conversational tone as they drove by. I shot 2 officers right there, and they kept on going. Of course, Ronneberg's terrified and a very religious man, and he was thinking about his eternity at that point, and so it was pretty revealing for him. And so Sitz told Ronneberg that his Chrysler car would not be damaged as long as you don't get me in any shootouts with the police. So, and then as he was leaving, he gave Ronneberg his coat, $10, and said, "Pray for me." And Ronneberg just said, "I prayed for myself." And so that was that situation. So this is a picture of Leonard telling the deputy sheriff Ray Dillevue of his kidnapping a little bit later. So now Ronneberg's on foot, okay, walking back from Beulah to Spearfish, and everybody's thinking, if you see a strange man out walking around, so he didn't knock on any doors. He was afraid that someone was going to shoot him, that he would be suspected because he's wearing Sitz's coat, obviously. And so finally, a motorist, a rancher from Gillette, named Bert Sutton, picked him up, took him on into Spearfish, where immediately connected with the police and relayed the story and got the word out that Sitz has been headed into Wyoming. And so, again, they don't know where he went. He may have doubled back. It's all bluff, went a different direction, headed back towards South Dakota. Who knows what happened there, but that was that. So in Wyoming, I'm going to go through this a little quicker since it's in Wyoming. He gets stuck on the Moss Ski Road, and this family, the Geidinger family, didn't know who he was. There was some conflicting reports that they knew who he was or didn't know who he was. But at that time, he told him his wife was having a baby in Nebraska and he needed to get down there. He looked exhausted. He's probably a dad. And so they went ahead and pulled him out with the tractor. But just in case, Ada had a gun in the back seat while they were giving him a ride to his car. So just in case. But nothing happened. No problems with the civilians again. So they get him out, and then he takes off again in the vehicle. So now here, this is another picture of the Spearfish Police Station, where Ronneberg is in the middle, Bert Sutton is on the left, and officers on the right there. And so the word's out now that he's there. So the radio comes on the next morning, and the Geidingers hear the radio saying, "Oh, the fugitive George Sitz went into Wyoming, and we helped him get out." So a couple other people anecdotally in the Sundance area said, "Yeah, I remember my gas cans were at the end of the driveway the next morning. He must have stole gas from our place and then just did it in the middle of the night." Other people said they heard stuff going on outside their houses. So while he's in, the Sheriff Blakeman from Crook County is now involved with the search. While driving around the countryside, he steals a license plate, a Wyoming plate from Ed Matthews, which is a big deal at the end, and puts it on his car so he can keep going maybe undetected through Wyoming. But the license plates in Wyoming at that time were like phone numbers. So you had a book published of your license plates. So if you're walking in town, there's 118, 644. Oh, Ed Matthews must be in town today. You know, you could look through there and see. So anyway, I didn't know that was a thing, but I guess it was. So we'll go here. So the red dot there is obviously Beulah. Sundance is circled. They finally catch up to him at Lysite, Wyoming. And what ended up happening was one of the uh, ranchers out there saw the license plate 18-644. Well, that's his cousin's license plate. Small town. Wyoming, they say, is just a small town with long streets. So, well, that's my cousin's plate, but that's not my cousin's car. So he knew something was wonky, and he had just been to the livestock sale in Belle Fourche that week before and saw the wanted posters up for George Sitz. So he kind of had an idea of who they were looking for. They see him go through town. He's crisscrossing the highway, trying not to be on the main highway, but take the side roads. Well, he drives through this town called Lysite, Wyoming, twice. And somebody perked up and said, wait a minute, this guy's lost. And he's trying to go somewhere, but he doesn't know where he's going. So he's obviously not a local person. And so he gets stuck in the snowbank just outside of Lysite and high centered on a piece of sagebrush, believe it or not. And so the sheriff of Casper in Natrona County said, okay, when you approach him, look like a farmer. He'll probably not shoot it out with you. So he's just sitting there in the car, frostbit feet, and here these two supposed farmers are walking up to him. Do you need any help? And he said, sure. So he gets out of the car, closes the door, and he's walking toward them. And then that's when they pull the guns on him and say, police, put your hands up. And he knew he was done at that point. He did turn and look at the pistols on the front seat, but he thought the better of it. He said, if I'd have had him on me, I'd have had the shootout, but he didn't have him with him. So they did not flash badges until it was after the fact. This was the drawing that George Sitz actually made of his trek through Wyoming. He did it for a reporter. Reporters had access to the jail cells. Just walk down there and talk to the prisoners if you wanted to. So Casper reporter went down there and said, where'd you go in Wyoming? So he drew him a little picture of all the places he went. Strange days back then. So anyway, this is how it looked at the Casper jail. Sitz, of course, is on the right, looking perturbed. And those are the Wyoming authorities that picked him up. This is the picture when he's brought back to South Dakota, put in the jail in Deadwood. The man standing between Sitz and the police officer there is Ross Dunn, with kind of a sick look on his face, because about 5 minutes before that, George Sitz had said, I stayed in your basement for a week. And he was totally embarrassed in front of all of his colleagues at that point. And so that was kind of a bad thing, but you can see why the look on his face isn't, he looks a little nauseous. So let's see. Again, George Sitz liked to talk, so he chatted people up on the way back to South Dakota. He admitted to killing the officers, but he was only pleading manslaughter, kind of a self-defense thing. It wasn't premeditated. And they assigned special deputies to the cell to make sure George does not attempt another escape. And of course, one of those deputies is Ross Dunn, and another gentleman named Jack McCardle to guard the jail. Ronneberg, the man who was kidnapped, received an $800 in a reward money. Some Casper deputies received $500. And the two ranchers that actually identified the license plate got $100 each. And so Ronneberg's car was returned with only minor damage to a gear assembly and one tire. No bullet holes. And so on March 18th, 1946, this legal system's speeding up. A month later, he's on trial for murder. And so in Deadwood. And onlookers stand outside the jail, hoping to get a look at him when he comes to the window. I've heard stories that there were actually women that wanted to, they were romantically inclined to George because he was so good looking. Stuff happens. And his defense attorney was John Heffron, and Mr. Heffron said the killings were a spur-of-the-moment decisions, not a planned crime. Sitz had told authorities that he knew Matthews was a lawman because he had a car and a siren, but claimed that he didn't know who Malcolm was. but he shot him first and turned his fire on Matthews. So prosecutors were led by Lawrence County State's Attorney Clinton Richards, and brought out withering forensic evidence and ballistics and fingerprints and a whole bunch of stuff to just kind of parade this in front of the court, even though Sitz had already admitted to shooting. Another key piece of evidence was a small postal receipt for a Christmas package that Matthews had sent to a ranch hand family in Gillette. The Matthews family owns the T7 Ranch in south of Gillette. Also, the Matthews Block, Matthews Opera House in Spearfish, so they're a very prominent family, well known. And so a lot of people were interested in this one. So Sitz was actually put on trial only for the murder of Matthews. Malcolm was a backup plan if something went wrong with Matthews, but so he was never convicted of killing the sheriff. That piece of paper meant that he had taken the wallet from Matthews. And Heffron was getting a little frustrated as defense attorney, saying he's already admitted to the crime, so why do you keep piling on this evidence piece after piece? But prosecutors wanted to show the calculated and remorseless actions that Sitz had taken. They pushed hard for the death penalty, telling the jury it was their duty to remove indecency from society by means of the electric chair. And the jury and judge agreed. Sitz's crime was part of a larger plot to escape, and the lawmen stood in the way. So on March 22nd, the jury found Sitz guilty of murder, and on March 30th, Judge Charles Hayes sentences Sitz to die in the electric chair. So there's a lot of photos in the archive at the Deadwood Fassbender collection, and you got to scroll through because they're not identified. So I found this picture. They're repairing a tire, apparently taking Sitz to the penitentiary. He's sitting in the back seat, and they're fixing a tire on the car. They said after the sentencing, and they were heading back to Sioux Falls to put him in the penitentiary, Sitz needed to stop the car because he got violently ill and was vomiting on the side of the road. And they thought, well, it's finally sunk in. Sitz now knows he's going to die. And they asked George, what, you're finally feeling bad about what you've done? He said, no, something I ate. So he got back in the car and off they went. So apparently this happened someplace. They took a picture of it. So they said back in the penitentiary, Sitz was quiet most of the way across South Dakota, and since he smiled and said nothing was bothering him. He just didn't like police and law officers. And he wrote a letter toward the end that he looked at himself as a winner, even though he was going to die in the electric chair. He basically said, this is the first time the police have ever helped me escape from prison. And so he's going to escape via the electric chair. But a year later, April 8th, 1947, Sitz is executed at the state penitentiary. DCI agent Floyd Short, a personal friend of the two slain officers, flips the switch. Some years later, Reed Richards, the son of prosecuting attorney Clinton Richards, offered some new details. Years after Sitz's execution, Dad was over at the Lawrence County Courthouse and noticed a nice-looking older lady kind of wandering around, and he asked if he could help her. She introduced herself as Sitz's mother, Mrs. Mildred Rose of Cornelius, Oregon. Sitz said that she had just wanted to come to the place where he had been tried. And Dad talked to her a little and thought her to be a very nice person. Thereafter, he opined that if Heffron had called Sitz's mother to the stand in his defense, the jury just might have opted for life in prison rather than the death penalty. So, not a lot of other information about her. So Sitz left a bit of a legacy to humanity. Shortly after his execution, his corneas were removed, and according to his wishes, they were used to successfully restore eyesight to the blind through an eye bank in New York. He didn't want that to get out because he didn't want people to think he was soft. But they still released that information. And he's buried in an unmarked grave in Sioux Falls. There's hundreds of people who vividly remember the manhunt. The memories are fading. Website postings on law enforcement memorials continue to mention the two slain officers. In 2021, A physical marker was placed north of I-90 exit 10 where the two murders occurred. So if you ever go up that way, you'll probably see them under the big high voltage lines that go across the highway there. So on May 10th, 2021, the South Dakota DOT, Butte and Lawrence County, Crook County Sheriff's Offices, Highway Patrol, DCI, and other law enforcement supporters dedicated the sign and remember these two lawmen and dozens of others who spent many hours wrapping up this case. The gentleman pictured there is Tom Matthews' son, and he was only 4 or 6 years old at the time his father was killed. And he still lives in the area and came to the dedication, which was nice. He thought it was very appropriate. And he said that throughout the years, law officers have kind of checked in on him every now and then to make sure he's doing okay. And he's doing fine. And so, let's see. As far as Malcolm's daughter, she was 9 months old when he was killed. I don't know if it played anything into her decision, but Malcolm's wife, I don't think she ever got over the fact that Sitz was never tried for her husband's killing. And so she moved to California. She was a school teacher. She taught there the rest of her life. Had some land interests with the family back in South Dakota, but came back for that once in a while, but never really made it her home here ever again. And so I did speak with the daughter on the phone a year and a half ago, and they don't have a lot of ties here anymore. And so she was interested. Yeah, that was my dad, but she had more admiration for her mother, single mom her whole life, worked in the school system just to support her daughter, and that was her life, and that's her memory. So if you go upstairs in the Campbell, there's a courthouse in Deadwood, Lawrence County Courthouse. Upstairs, there's a display case with these items in there. I think that's the handcuff belt that they used for George Sitz, one of the posters, and then a 10-year retrospective they had in one of the magazines. And that's pretty much all there is to mention that up there, but you can see it. It's on display. And so let's see. What else do I have? So I started this probably in the early 90s, and I was doing another project on old abandoned towns in Meade County, and I started talking to some of these people that lived out there at the time, and sitting at Buster Babb's house, and he brought this up out of nowhere. Said, "Well, you know about George Sitz?" No. So he told me what he knew about it, and I had never heard of it. And Floyd McGilvery, I think, was there at the time. And so they both got chatting about it, and it was like, I wished I'd have been recording that conversation, because I was trying to get, well, tell me about this sulfur town. I want to know about that. But no, they were talking about George Sitzford. Anyway, long story short, that story developed on the side after I got the other town's story, because that was a college project. I had to turn that in. So over the years, I've gotten resources from other places, and newspaper clippings and that sort of stuff. So it was pretty, it keeps evolving and developing over the years, but that's the story of George Sitz and the killing of the two lawmen in northern Black Hills. So any thoughts?
Didn't they have to borrow the electric chair from Nebraska?
In Nebraska or Illinois, I couldn't remember where they got it from. They didn't have an electric chair. And some years later, they had interviewed the Attorney General to see if, since he was the only person ever executed by electric chair in South Dakota, and then the death penalty went away for a while. And so they asked him if it was warranted to do that, and he said absolutely. Once he heard the details of the case, what kind of guy George Sitz was, he was kind of a sociopath. He could talk to you like a normal person and then just be cold-hearted and kill somebody and just go back to the normal conversation. He just never registered with him in that regard. So it was warranted according to the Attorney General. So yeah, so they did have to borrow the electric chair. Yes.
There was never a high-speed chase involved in his capture at all, was there?
He went quietly the time they caught him in Minnesota and the time that they caught him in Wyoming.
You know, sometimes we are given these family stories, and sometimes they're true, and sometimes they're not. I was always told, I was born over in the eastern part of the state, and I was always told that my dad trained one summer with the highway patrol. And I know he learned to drive and, you know, slam the brakes on and make a big circle and all those exciting movie-looking things. And that he had something to do with the capture of George Sitz.
Okay.
But I kind of think that wasn't true. But I sure got a lot out of what he told us.
He could have been in Spearfish during a search, and so there was hundreds of lawmen there
Yeah,
searching. And so, yeah, the irony, you know, the radios weren't like they were, so you couldn't, you know, fax things or email stuff. So you basically had to do phone calls and try to get it cross country. The radio system, the first law enforcement radio system installed in the Black Hills was at Terry Peak, and it was actually done by Matthews. He helped spearhead that project to get radios so you could have radio communications in that area. So he was well respected in that career area. Another thing I didn't mention, that Matthews got a commendation from the FBI after World War II for his work on counterterrorism, counterintelligence, because there was a World War II dissenter from Sturgis that was pretty vocal about being against the war. Can't remember his name off the top of my head, but him and another guy got a cabin up in Spearfish Canyon. And then the FBI was just saying, I wonder what these guys are up to, what they're doing. So they sent Matthews up there to rent the next cabin. And they've installed a phone up there so he could call and tell them their movements, when they're leaving, when they're coming back, you know, that kind of thing. So he did that for I don't know how long, observing these war dissenters, and just to make sure they weren't up to something bad. And so J. Edgar Hoover gave him a commendation after the war. So yes.
When he was in the schoolhouse, where was the vehicle that he had?
He'd gotten stuck somewhere along the Crook City Road. Now, I drove that not too long ago, trying to figure out if he got stuck. He went past the schoolhouse and got stuck and then walked back, or he got stuck and then walked to the schoolhouse. But if there's a high bank where it looks like he ran off the road and into the high bank and couldn't get out of there. So I think he maybe went past the schoolhouse, got stuck, and then walked back.
And then how far from the schoolhouse to the cellar?
I think he had to walk quite a ways to get in Deadwood. There's a railroad track that runs there, so he probably followed that from Whitewood to Deadwood. It is, and that's why his feet were frostbitten. And so he needed to heal up a little bit too in that basement or cellar. So yes.
It might be an embellishment, but we were told that he was up in the attic of the schoolhouse and a couple of people came and searched around and he was up there way.
Yes, that actually happened. Officers looked at the schoolhouse while he was upstairs. And
They said somebody was there, a policeman.
it can never be confirmed, but they didn't look upstairs for some reason. And it was like an attic. So you want to poke your head up and just, see him, or I don't know how you'd want to do that, but they didn't look up there. And so they left. They thought, there's no way he could be here, because there were, the snow was just perfect for George Sitz to escape, because he could get somewhere and then the snow covered all his tracks. And so he could have walked in there and there's no tracks going in here. There's no way he could be here. So, but they did go back and realize that he was up there. Yes.
Did anybody was there ever any mention of his mother talking about his behavior as a child? I mean, I'm just wondering how he was charismatic, civilians, is there something that happened?
Well, she left when he was 7 years old, and her and her husband divorced and left him with grandma. So grandma raised George basically from age 7. And so I don't know why. Things were weird in the 30s. Stuff happened. And so he was the day he died, or in the electric chair, was also, he didn't even get headlines for that because that's the same day Henry Ford passed away. And so Henry Ford passes, and then down here in the corner of the paper is George Sitz executed. So, it, anyway,
Tim,
yes.
At the time of the shooting in January, it got dark early. What time was it that he shot the law enforcement?
Between 6 and 7.
So it was dark. when
It
he
was
shot.
dark when, yeah. So the stop was clunky because the truck was coming from another direction, and so they couldn't block the road because they wanted to let the truck get by. So as they were stopping, oh, we all better pull over to one side of the road, and then that's,
It had to be really confusing.
yes, it had to be. And so, you know, you get out on the driver's side, and everybody gets out of the car, and George was good with a handgun and quick and accurate, obviously, at close range, and heartless about it. He wasn't going to waste time. So
How did he survive on that attic of that school? What?
he still had the stuff that he took from the McGuire Ranch. He had the can of honey is up there, and obviously adrenaline, but I think he had some other items that he had taken from the ranch that he still had with him that he took into the.
He had to have started a fire down on the first floor to burn his trees. So how did they probably just thought.
He cleaned up after himself, and then he did not start any fires while he was up in the attic, obviously, but he didn't want to alert his presence there either. But it was starting to get cold, so this was one of those clippers that came through, and a lot of snow at the front end. Then it got cold, like below zero during the nights at least, and so he was needing to get out of there. So, but he looked pretty rough at the end when they captured him, but he looked all cleaned up and good to go when the trial started. So. His wife. Okay, so they put an armed guard outside of her house in Minneapolis in case he showed up again, thinking he might go back for help again. So they observed her. She asked for it, actually, said, could you check, make sure I'm protected in case he comes back, because I wanted him out, basically. And then I lost track of her. My guess is she lived a quiet life after that. She didn't publicize the fact that she was married to him at some point. The girlfriend was in Texas. She never went to Oregon, so she didn't want him following her either. So she said, yeah, I'm in Oregon, but she was actually down in El Paso. And police down there also guarded her because she worked in a retail store, and then so they made sure she made it safely back and forth in case George had somehow gotten down there. So it was, plus if he made contact with them, they could maybe capture him. So it was a way for that, but she was grateful for that. But again, I lost track of her too. Some of them changed their names, and it's hard to kind of track them down at that point. But yeah, George had said, like, if he had any parting words and advice, is that he said women were his biggest problem, and they're a trap and a snare, and don't get mixed up with them, because it caused him all these problems. So yeah, that was his opinion. But anyway, yeah.
I have one
Yes.
observation that has nothing to do with this, but in the picture of Mr. Dunn in the basement looking at the jars and stuff, it looks to me like he has a roll of paper towels in his
Yes,
hand.
it does.
I didn't know they had paper towels in the 1940s.
Well, like I said,
Well, we never had paper towels.
they had,
Right
yeah, it looks like a roll of paper towels.
there. I just didn't think, I gotta go home and Google, where do they use their rolls of paper towels?
She'd make a good detective, wouldn't she?
Yeah.
It's a good question.
So why is the rope hanging there, Bonnie? What else?
It looks like he's got a sprayer of some kind.
That's actually a battery powered light.
Oh, sure, electric cord.
Yeah. So,
Oh, sure, I see now the light part of it, yeah.
yeah. So it's, I don't know. It's crazy how he could have hid down there for a week and nobody noticed, but he did. Ronneberg, he's the guy that got kidnapped. His two sons were like 8 or 10 years old at the time. So he was obviously concerned about his family. One of his sons, Ronneberg, died like 8, 10 years later. His son said he never got over being kidnapped, and it just haunted him. And he died an early death because of the stress it put on him. And so his youngest son became a Lutheran minister over in Baltimore. And so I think he's near retirement or in retirement, but he said someday he's going to come back out here and see where all this happened and kind of look it over. But yeah, so it's interesting to follow where it happened to these people. Yes.
Do they ever advertise or say that when he was in that cellar before they caught him? The reason I say that is because my next door neighbor, I was 8 years old at that time, and she was the same age as I was. And her and her sister slept in the basement of their house. And there was a room there, and then there was another room that was not finished, and there was no doorway through there. It was like a cellar. And I can remember her talking about, I'm afraid to go down to Sturgis because he might be in that cellar. Now, what would give her the idea that he was in the cellar?
I don't know, other than lock your doors was the big thing, because he could get into your house.
She was definitely about this.
Yeah, it was mentioned. He told the authorities when he was met up with them when they picked him up in South Dakota. When the Wyoming guys dropped him off in Lusk and they did the switch, that's when he said, "Hey, I slept in your cellar for a week." So it was after he was captured that he revealed that. Now, whether they went downstairs and said, "Somebody's been living in our cellar," I don't know that, but yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, I may be diverging here, but I was intrigued by the paper towel detective, and I asked Siri or Safari, Google, paper towels were invented in 1879
Oh my
by
gosh.
brothers Clarence and Irvin Scott, who created a thinner version of the towel for medical use as a light toilet tissue. The first rolls of toilet tissue were sold for 10 cents and included 1,000 sheets per roll. I just thought that was kind
Up
of
100 years before.
Those were luxuries.
I was gonna ask if they still had stairs and robots.
Yes, Jim.
He was well fed when he was in the cellar, but I'm wondering how he answered nature's call while he was down there for a week. Did he wait till everybody was gone and then head upstairs, or?
One could speculate that the cellar had is like you see those big giant above ground planter boxes filled with sand, and they put their potatoes and ground vegetables in there to keep for the winter. So I don't want to say that that's what happened, but that he had his own sandbox, and he very well could have maybe used that for stuff I think about too, you know. And so if you think you're pulling a carrot out, you may not be, you know. So yes. So
Apparently he didn't smoke.
apparently not.
That'd be kind of freaky for the sheriff to think about his daughter going down there.
Yeah.
Is there ever anything written about that?
Well, he, Mr. Dunn, and I hope there's nobody here that's related to him, but he was a little bit of a braggadocious type of a person. He liked to be around law enforcement, get his picture taken, talk about his things that he did. He was also a blacksmith, and he worked for different ranches around doing blacksmith work. But I think it was more of an embarrassment to him than it was concern about his family, because he blamed his daughter for not locking the door, which I think she's only 11 years old, and she carried that with her whole life. She still does. So anyway,
So where did you say he went from the Duns?
from the Duns, he walked into Deadwood, and that's when he carjacked the gas station guy. Yes.
Were there any books written about this?
Not yet.
Not yet. Not yet.
Or any journalists that interviewed him while he was in prison?
There was one in Casper that got him right away, which was a good scoop. And so he talked about a lot of stuff then. And there was another, I wished I had her name in front of me. She was a columnist from the Lee Deadwood paper. And she was very good. And she was there for 50 years. And she would have been probably the best person to get perspective on this, because she advocated for the death penalty all along and said, look, if we don't dispose of this guy, his kids are going to ask us why not. And so that was sort of how that went down. But she was probably the best coverage of it. The night they were looking for him, she grabbed a photographer, jumped in the car and headed to Spearfish, met up with one of the roadblocks, and they're standing there trying to take pictures of the roadblocks with their headlights on and police pointing guns at them because they didn't know who they were. And so she was in the middle of it from the beginning.
So, there any psychologists back then that ever interviewed him while he was in prison, or did they?
I don't think so. It was weird. They talked to his friends from his childhood. That's about as close as they got. And they said he was a relatively normal kid. He was competitive and athletic. And so if they were going to have a foot race, he always wanted to win, or whatever it was. They played cops and robbers. George actually took the robber side. So maybe that was a natural progression. I don't know. But yeah, he felt comfortable. Yes.
If you ever write a book or remember, there's something about his morality, his values, his ethics in regard to the mother and baby that had a vehicle, and the couple that he saw were necking and he let them go. I mean, it sounds crazy, but there's some kind of a value there.
Yeah.
Right. But it seemed to me like he was, when it was a cop or anybody connected with the police, that's what drove him nuts.
Yep. He was still talking trash to cops right up to the point he sat in the electric chair. He never had any remorse about it. And so but civilians, it was just odd. You'd think, he shot the liquor store guy, and he said that was self-defense because he went and grabbed his pistol. So but he didn't steal anything at that point. So it's just,
Life was just wasted.
yeah. And you think about it, you can't blame it on the broken home situation raised by his grandma. She was in tough health, so she didn't have a lot of involvement in his life. He would, how it was in the 30s, probably he would run back and forth to school, however many miles it was, and he kind of had a free reign, and he didn't have a lot of supervision. So anyway.
Involved with bootlegging?
He said he was raised by bootleggers, so maybe I'm sure he knew he could drive a car, not very well in the South Dakota, Wyoming weather, but he could drive a vehicle pretty well. And I even looked that up. Cars back then got 18 miles to the gallon, so I tried to figure out how far he could go on a tank of gas without having to fill up. But I don't know that he paid for a lot of gas.
Well, this isn't about George Setz, but as you come into Spearfish and head down Jackson, there's one of those huge old houses. I think it's called the Apple Blossom.
Yep.
And that's where the Matthews.
Yes.
Live.
Yep.
And I had some friends that rented that for a month this summer, so I got to go in that
Oh.
house. And they did a little research about it. And they said when Tom Matthews was killed, they brought the body in and had to wait.
In the house. That's neat to know, because I was trying to imagine. I've seen pictures of it online, so I was trying to imagine, okay, that's the kitchen. That's where he would have been sitting when he got up and left for the last time.
It's amazing.
So, and it's made out of concrete. It looks like it's brick or something, but it's actually concrete poured walls. So, yeah. But yeah, they were his Matthew's wife. She sold the house and I think the block as part of, because she was one of the socialites in town, and so she was pretty well known, and that could have been the reason why they got the trial instead of Malcolm. I don't know that, but she was pretty well known. She remarried, and so moved on with her life. So
Was the Sturgis connection law enforcement?
it mostly would have been law enforcement. The fact that he went through Meade County, that's as close as a brush as I could get. There were sightings everywhere, so they chased down everything. So if somebody said they saw him in this town, they would go there. And so they drew law enforcement from all over the region. To Spearfish was kind of the headquarters or the central area, and then they fanned out from there. But middle of winter, you don't have a lot of daylight to search, and the snow had come and it was a little tough getting around. But then once they lost track, no sightings, it was like, well, we don't know where he is. So
Growing up, going to country school, this story was just retold and retold and retold all the time when I grew up. And every time I went to country school, every country school had the attic with the door in the front and then the ceiling. And every time I heard something in the ceiling when I was at school, I thought somebody like George Sitz.
George Sitz is in sound. Yeah, and you're not joking. I talked to some other people older than you that remember they're traumatized by it because they were kids and they were like, I was afraid of any noises outside the house at night. It could have been a dog running by or a deer or whatever, but they were terrified of any noise that they couldn't explain. And so some of them are still that way today. They just very guarded at night in their house alone. So it is because they were in, it was all the way to Hewlett. I mean, they didn't know where he was. So anybody you got these warnings and, your parents were probably saying, hey, don't go outside by yourself. If you have an outhouse, take somebody with you, that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
The outhouse would be a good place for stories to originate.
Yes. So, yeah, so it's something I've just been kind of keeping track of. And yeah, I am this close to getting it into a large pamphlet, I'm going to call it. Not a book. Large pamphlet with lots more photos. So.
You got more photos than what you have here.
Oh, yeah, I do. I could only share a few because time, I could be here for another 3 hours.
No, this was perfect. This is perfect. Well, thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
I always like to give our speakers
Thank you.
for
Too kind.
coming, and we couldn't do this without people coming and talking. So.
More than I'm worth. So.
Oh, well, we appreciate
Even if
it.
it's $1, it's more.
But it's a bit more than $1.
Okay, well, thank you.
So anyway, that's it.
Yeah,
Just
thanks all for coming.
Yep. And then we'll, I guess we'll see you all get back in October. So.